not a licensed amateur radio operator. I've done the training. I'm studying for my exam. I just haven't written it yet. There's lots of people who know way more than I do, but they're not here, and they don't look at this stuff the same way that I do. I look at it as a necessary tool for a worst-case scenario. They look at it as a hobby that they take seriously, and that's great, because those are the guys that are really going to be connecting with groups, right? The guys like the guy that I'm going to be going seeing that's mentoring me and kind of coaching me so I can pass my exam. So we'll talk about that. Radio Amateurs of Canada. So if anybody wants to become a licensed amateur, I absolutely encourage you. I'm doing it. I know a couple other people that are doing it. It's a great hobby, and it's a really good skill set to have, but it's definitely not for everybody. There's so many rabbit holes you can go down with this stuff, but if you want to do it, Radio Amateurs of Canada, it's rac.ca, rac.ca. They do a course, so the course runs twice a week for 3 months, and the classes are 2 to 3 hours each. And $50. But anyway, if anybody's interested, these guys are great. The course was amazing. Tons and tons and tons of information. The exam to get certified is 100 questions, multiple choice. But you got to know your stuff for the most part. Some of the stuff you can kind of wing it if you kind of have a general idea. But like the stuff that I was talking about that I'm going to be seeing Joel about tomorrow is involved. So anyway, anybody wants more information on that, I'm happy to connect you. Shameless plug. So I only grow these workshops and stuff through word of mouth. I don't put this out on normal channels. Originally I thought about putting it out on Facebook, but I'm like, no. You guys are all paying, so obviously don't worry about the donation part, but if you guys can refer your friends or put a testimonial, send me a testimonial through this website. If you just scroll down, there's a reach out form. I'd love to have that if you feel like it's worthwhile and you've got some value out of it. And even if you didn't, let me know, because that's feedback from me as well. Always try to get better, right? As I mentioned here, so you weren't here, but I only grow this workshop through word of mouth, so rattle it off to your friends, tell them about it. You can go on the website. Testimonials are awesome, and with that, let's get into it. So, why do we need communications? We want to throw out some ideas.
I know what's going on.
Okay, find out what's going on. Gather information. Okay.
The snail mail just doesn't always
This doesn't work. Even though CRA and Service Canada only uses snail mail, it tells you something. So,
yeah.
No offense to the posties in the room.
Checking with family and friends.
Yep, absolutely. And what's the big one once we get into a bit of a kinetic exchange or a tactical situation?
What's going on in the world?
Yeah, coordinating efforts, right?
Yeah.
So, checking on each other, gathering intelligence and passing it on, and then coordinating your efforts so that you're doing something with a purpose. Okay, it's very hard to do that in the dark, especially if you've got multiple people that are all trying to coordinate and work together. You've got to have some way to connect with each other. So, what do we use? Anything here that I haven't hit? We've got cell phones, we've got landlines, we've got internet, social media. All of this stuff looks really, really fancy and awesome. What's the problem with it? This stuff can get turned off with a switch, or a little bit more. That's a collapsed tower. This is becoming a huge issue now. China has had a real issue with the Starlink satellites. So now they're looking for a way to shoot them out of the sky, which is awesome. They're going to be putting up their own Starlink network. That's probably going to be weaponized, so that's another dark conversation. This is one that's on fire in Toronto. This was a few years ago. Radio is the last bastion of free communication. And that's why we're doing this, and that's why we want to make sure that everybody's tied in. All right, so let's get into this. Factors affecting radio communication. So TX is transmit, RX is receive, okay? the frequency. Frequency is going to tell you, well, it's going to decide how far you're actually going to be able to reach under ideal conditions. Okay? Higher frequencies, they don't go as far, but they go through stuff. That's why we use UHF for like in the city. Okay? VHF, very high frequency. This is ultra high frequency. They are much longer wavelength transmissions, but they're much more susceptible to interference. So they're great for rural, but in the city, at his house in Canyon Meadows, from my house on UHF, but I can't do it on VHF. And I can talk to him clear as day from my house.
And this does both.
Yeah, it does both. Yeah, you bet. Most of the handhelds these days that you can buy do both. It's just not really worth anybody's time to build any that only do one or the other. Some of the base stations, some of the older base stations are only VHF. The antenna, your antenna setup makes a big difference. The antenna on the end of that isn't going to get you as far as something like this on the top of your house, obviously. This is designed. This whole antenna is called a Yagi, but basically what it does is that's a directional antenna. So you can face it somewhere and you'll get way further in that direction, but you won't get much. You get a little bit behind you, but not much off to the sides. That's kind of how that works. The other thing that makes a big difference to your ability to reach somebody is the power output. So most of the handhelds on the market these days are 5 watts or less. We're going to talk about some GMRS radios, which are the ones that little kids use. Those ones are like 2 watts, but these ones are 10 watt handhelds. So frequency antenna power output, obviously more wattage, you're going to send your signal much further. That's just basic physics.
How do we know, like for us, how would we know how far it is?
You don't. You're going to know when you are able to reach somebody that's kind of further than you might have thought you would have been able to reach. You'd be like, oh shit, they're like 50 clicks away. That's pretty good.
Okay.
You know? Or man, they're only 5 clicks and I can't reach them. Maybe I need to switch to UHF frequency. The other thing that's going to affect your transmission and reception is interference. So there's going to be physical interference like buildings and things like that, and then terrestrial interference. So there'll be hills, curvature of the earth. So the earth is like this, and if you've got somebody standing here and somebody standing here, at some point, like you'll be able to reach each other like this, but if they go too much further down here, you've got the earth in the way and they're not going to actually be able to reach, okay? So curvature of the earth makes a difference, especially when you're dealing with the handhelds because they're not designed to go as far. Okay?
Is that going to change eventually?
No, that's just the nature of radio. Curvature of the earth, you can't get around that. I mean, you can.
Well,
we're
going to get free energy everywhere, so like, when you think about it, you know?
Well, it's not so much about energy, that's just about line of sight. So these handhelds and that base station, those are line of sight radios. There's basically 3 kinds of radio signals that we're going to talk about. There's HF, high frequency, VHF, very high frequency, and UHF, ultra high frequency. HF is like global communication, but it works very differently from the ones that we've got in the rig. So let's talk about that. This is an HF radio station. Guys that get into this stuff for real, like that's a pretty scoop setup. Like he's set up for everything here. This would be more my speed, a much simpler sort of a station, but there's still loads and loads of gear. Right? You're going to have a radio, you probably have a few radios, maybe some that are designed for different bandwidths or different wavelengths, I should say. The way that HF works is there's a ground wave that will travel out, and it'll go anywhere between 25 clicks and 500, depending on what frequencies you're using. But the sky wave is the one that gets you around the world, and it basically bounces off the ionosphere, and that's what your northern lights are. Spaceweather.com. But the way that the HF works is it bounces off the ionosphere, and it can keep going all the way around the Earth, and you can actually hear it on the back end. It's actually kind of a unique sort of a thing. This is extremely complicated stuff. You got a ground wave that runs 25 to 500K, depending on your frequency that you're using. The Skywave will do 2,000 to 4,000. But remember, when that thing goes up, and the reason I'm doing multiple is that it doesn't just send out one signal. It's constantly sending them out, right? They're going to bounce. If I'm here, and Brandy's here, and Pedro's over here, she's not going to hear me. She's in what's called the skip zone. If she's close enough, she might get the ground wave, but most likely it's going to go right over top of her. And so she's not actually going to be able to hear us. But I'll be able to talk to him, and he might be in New York, right? I've listened on my HF radio, and I've actually heard guys talking from St. Paul Island out on the East Coast to the net manager was in Edmonton, I think, and there was guys up in Yukon, and I was listening to them. Pretty cool. So it's based on atmospheric conditions. So as the atmospheric conditions change, like the auroras we had the other night, it affects the radio signals. Lots of variables to HF communication: time of day, angle of radiation, so the angle that your antenna is sending the signal up. Solar activity, very, very complicated with extremely long antennas. So I've got an HF radio in my trailer. The antenna, it's basically a 2-wire antenna called a dipole, and it sits on a 30-foot mast, and it goes down like that. These legs are 52 feet long each. So end to end, that antenna's over 100 feet. And it's just basically a copper wire. So it's a little bit cumbersome for us to use when I want to talk to Brandy at her house. That's why we've got these ones. So we're talking about that. So that is as far as we're going to go on HF radio. If you want to learn about this, definitely do the RAC course. Become a licensed amateur. This is where the fun is. Making contacts all over the world with stuff that you've got set up on your house. So the easiest way to deal with it, though, so that you can actually hear what's going on and you don't have to be able to talk, is to just buy a receiver. This is about $300. This is a really, really good one. I've actually got one of these. I've laid in my bed at night and listened to Radio Cuba, New Zealand, all over the place, all over down into the States. Heard a Tennessee station, that was kind of fun.
That's how you're really going to find out about like all the storms and all the other crap
Well,
going on.
you may or may not hear about the storms, but if you want to have access to those communications that are coming from all over the world, so if
well,
we've
what's
got
going on in the rest of the world
Correct.
is what I'm saying, because
Exactly.
we're not here.
So if you want access to the HF information without going to all the trouble of learning how to run an HF station, this is the way to do it. Just pick up one of those, and it comes with an extension antenna that's like 20 or 25 feet long, and it helps you pick stuff up. So yeah, but I've laid in just with this antenna. I listen to stuff in my bed at night. It's kind of cool. So. Okay, we're going to talk about VHF and UHF. So VHF is very high frequency. This is your regional communications. This one. UHF is local. That's this one. All right. These radios are the two that I've got at the back of the room. They're both dual band. They both do VHF. They both do UHF. You just got to make sure you've got an antenna on the base station that will do both. Otherwise, you end up getting mess up your radio. So we're going to talk about that right now. So VHF. So where high frequency is from 3 up to 30 megahertz, VHF is from 30 megahertz all the way up to like 300. Okay, so your ham bands, which are the licensed amateurs, are between 144 and 148. The communication that we made a couple of weeks ago, where I was talking to one of his guys, was on 151 megahertz. So even that little bit from 151 up to 166 made the difference between me being able to talk to him and me not being able to talk to him. So the frequency really makes a difference in the distance that you're going to reach, depending on the terrain that's kind of in between. So we're going to talk more about that. But VHF, traditionally, longer distance, very susceptible to interference. That's why it doesn't work so well over cities. But when you're out of the city and you're trying to reach the city, like I can hit that repeater from over 100 clicks away from the city when I'm heading out to my trailer, which is out near Drum Hill. As long as I get up on a hill, I can hit that repeater. So, pretty cool.
And how do we figure out what frequencies will?
We're going to talk about that. So where HF is 3 to 30 and VHF is 30 to 300, UHF is 300 megahertz all the way up to 3 gigahertz. Okay? So this is going to be your 3G, okay? 5G, 5 gigahertz, okay? 5G is very dangerous shit. That's why I've actually turned my new phone that I just got back to LTE. I don't want anything with 5G, especially when I'm talking on it next to my head. So, the ham bands so this is where you'll find the licensed amateurs. For UHF are 430 to 450, okay? FRS, which we're going to talk about, is 460 to 470. And we're going to talk about those in a minute. UHF, traditionally shorter distance, less susceptible to interference. That's why I can Canyon Meadows from Mackenzie-town, but I can't reach him on a VHF frequency. He doesn't hear me, because there's too much interference and the signal doesn't actually reach him. Or it doesn't reach his radio with enough intelligibility for the radio to decipher it and say, here, here's what you're talking about. So that's the use case for UHF. So let's talk about repeaters. So what does a repeater do? Basically what it does is you put it up on a hill somewhere in between, and now you've increased your range. So let's say, if we go back to VHF, 100 kilometers to 160 on a good day. The 65 kilometer contact I made the other day was decent. I could hear him, but I probably wouldn't have been able to hear him at 100K because it was just garbled enough that I'm like, yeah, if it was almost twice the distance, we probably wouldn't have been able to connect. There's just a lot of interference between me and him. However, when I was driving back and forth to Edmonton every week because I had clients up there, I tested one of those base stations in my truck, and I was able to hit a repeater out in Rocky Mountain House from Crossfield all the way up to Lacombe. And that, as the crow flies, is like 100K, a little bit more, where that repeater is based. It's on a hilltop out there. So that means, if this is the repeater at Rocky Mountain House, if I can reach 100K to here and hit that repeater, and that repeater is that radio or better, it's going to be able to reach as far in the other direction, right? That's kind of the idea. So now all of a sudden I'm making contact with somebody that's 200K away. That's kind of handy, right? Because that's where you're going to get your regional communication. So something could be happening in Red Deer. We'll hear about it probably through a repeater between Red Deer and Calgary. So somebody will transmit onto that repeater will transmit to the city, and people that are listening here will be able to hear what's going on in Red Deer.
So a repeater is totally different than like a base station.
Yeah, well, a repeater's going to be made of a couple of base stations. You can make a repeater out of a couple of handhelds, but it's not really a good use of the handhelds because they don't have the wattage to be able to get that signal very far. But a 50-watt radio, that's a great option. So what a repeater does is it basically takes the signal and then sends it out again from a higher location so that hopefully it reaches further up. Okay? So that's basically what a repeater does. Okay, so it takes the signal, boosts it, and sends it out again. So that's what's going to connect communities. Okay? And that's how that works. So, how does that work? There we go. Okay, so repeaters work on simplex or duplex. So basically simplex, the transmit and the receive frequency are the same. Okay, so one person talks on 146.520, the other person hears it and then talks back on the same frequency. Okay? Duplex is where, and that's why he's got to put a picture of a repeater in this picture. So it transmits on one frequency and it receives on another. So it sends it to the repeater on one. The repeater takes it, boosts it, and sends it out on another. Okay? And the reason for that is that if you send it out on the same frequency, then you can end up having all sorts of feedback, and it's just not good. It's just not good practice. Okay?
Like distortion.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things that go sideways when you do that. But, so it sends it out on one and receives it on another. In order to actually access the repeater, though, you need tones. And a tone is basically an electronic key that the repeater can hear and say, ah, that's intended for me. Okay, open, transmit out. If it doesn't have that key, you could be on the same frequency, the repeater is not going to retransmit that communication. So you have to have those tones in order for the repeater to hear you. Cone-toted, cone-toted squelch system, and this is digital coded system. So these are basically your digital, this is your digital key, and this is an actual audible tone that the radio can actually hear. Just different technologies for the same job, okay? That's the key that opens the door to the repeater, okay? So then what happens is somebody transmits to the repeater, and then it takes that signal, hears the tone, and it goes, ah, we're good to go. Sends it out, all right? And that's, what we were just talking about in that last slide where you can spread the distance. And so that repeater that I just tried to hit, let's see if they're still yapping. Hands or chatty Cathy's? Okay, sounds like they're never stopped. So I can actually hit that on an 8-watt handheld from in here, and it's all the way up my nose.
And you can tell because of the.
Because it kicks back. Yeah, because that's the repeater hearing the tone, opening up, not hearing anything, and then closing. Okay? Otherwise, if I was talking, it would then send that out, and then everybody that was listening to that repeater would hear. Okay? But it's very staticky, and I had to key it a couple of times to get it. It may work better if it was a UHF frequency, or maybe it's just too far for UHF to actually reach. So there's a lot of different variables, but certainly not as many with the handhelds and base stations as with the HF setup. That's like complicated in a whole other way. So that's the difference. So basically simplex, transmit, receive on one, duplex, transmit, receive on two different frequencies. Okay? The reason I'm telling you this is because we're going to talk about something in a second. Actually, put it right there. There we go. A crossband repeater. This is a very handy tool. And those base stations actually come equipped with this built right in. So normally with a repeater, you need two radios coupled together with a thing called a duplexer to basically receive and then retransmit.
I
Okay?
don't like that CB.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like that
No, it's different than a CB because a CB is still line of sight two-way communication and it's simplex. It's not, there's no CB repeaters that I know of. Crossband will basically receive on UHF or VHF and then retransmit on the other. So, if you have a community group like this, we got the blue guys and we got the green guys. And if the blue guys can all talk to each other on their UHF. They're all talking to each other using their UHF, so unit to unit, okay? While they're doing that, this thing is picking up that UHF signal, and then it's sending it out on a VHF frequency. So what happens is, if we've got another group over here, they're all talking to themselves, they can hear each other, and they're all talking to themselves with their own UHF frequency, and this one might be different. So we'll call that, channel 2, we'll call this channel 1. So they're all going to be able to hear each other. They're all going to be able to hear each other, but their repeater is going to do the same thing. It's going to hear that, and then it's going to send it out. And if this is the same frequency, now what you've done is you've connected two communities. So if Brandy and I are in two different communities, I can be talking to this side of the room, let's say I'm talking to that side of the room just for this purpose of this demonstration. We can all be talking together. Our repeater, our crossband repeater, is going to hear us talking, and every transmission that we make, it's going to send over to Brandy's repeater, and her whole group is going to hear what we're saying as well.
You can be on different channels?
Yes, because what's happening is this one is the same. So no matter what you set these two, so you're going to have two of those base stations, one for each group, okay? And it's going to hear on UHF and then transmit on VHF. If, this is the beauty of it, when this transmission comes along on UHF and it hears it, it retransmits it on, when this comes from VHF, it hears it and then retransmits it on the UHF frequency that it's set to, which is the one that we're talking about. Pretty cool. Like, it's a really neat system. So you can have two complete communities that are literally working together real time, 100 clicks apart. So Brandy could talk to you using this repeater. We're all going to hear it, and then you guys are all going to hear what she's saying, even though she's just having a conversation with one person. But the nature of radio is everybody can hear it as long as they're on that frequency, right? Mm-hmm. So we could both be on the same channel. It doesn't matter. But because of the distance, we're not going to hear each other unless it's through the repeater. Because that UHF wave, it's not going to travel very far. It's not going to travel far enough. But the VHF does. So the crossband repeater is a very cool system that you can set up between two communities to connect them, and everybody can talk to each other. So I had one set up on my house for a while, and I could talk to my buddy in Black Diamond on my handheld while I'm walking my dog.
But that's what you set up for them too, right?
Yeah, he's got that same setup, but different frequencies. But
Yeah.
so I was able to talk to our buddy in Black Diamond while I'm walking my dog on a little 2-watt handheld, because that's all I needed for my radio to reach my garage, which is where my antenna is. And then that to retransmit it out to Black Diamond and him to be able to hear it at his house.
So the 5G towers, do they have this technology too?
Totally different technology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
We're talking radio, that's 5G is very, very short wavelength. That's why you need lots and lots of 5G towers.
That was at ground control.
So if we're going to talk about 5G, we're going to see a lot of towers in every community before that system is fully up and running, because it just doesn't reach as far as some of the lower frequencies. Okay. But basically, you've got a UHF here, you've got a VHF there, and the beauty of this system is that this unit, so if we've got somebody that happens to be over here, maybe they're out of range of communicating with these guys, but they'll be able to hear the VHF repeat.
Nice catch.
Thanks. You can't train reflexes like that.
Either have it or you don't.
So what will happen is he may be too far away to actually talk to these guys with his handheld directly, but if his handheld has enough power, he might have enough VHF capability to reach the antenna and talk to his people through it.
And hear the other people too.
Well,
Right.
generally,
Yeah, okay,
if you're
yeah.
hearing somebody else, if they're, and you know there's a repeater, then.
Okay, that's a really good question.
Down.
So what she asked is will the other people be able to hear as well? So what will happen is he'll be communicating with this on VHF. It'll be talking to these people on UHF. So these people will hear. When these people transmit, it's going to be UHF, and then this thing's going to send it out on VHF. If he's within range of that communication, yes, he'll hear it. If he's not, he won't hear the VHF coming back. because he's too far. Okay, but he will hear the UHF coming from his repeater talking to his buddies and things like that. So they'll be able to keep him in the loop with what's going on over here. But he may not be able to hear them directly. Or he might.
Yeah, right.
You may be able to hear both, and then, then you've got a kind of a backup repeater in case something happens to one of them. You got a dude on a hill with a radio you can actually connect it to. Didn't catch that. My arm's on
I cursed you.
Nice. You did, yeah. Yeah.
Is there a map with these repeaters so that people can use them?
Okay, there is a map, there are repeaters that are known.
Right.
We're probably not going to be using them.
Okay. Is there
After the
like-
balloon goes up, we're going to be setting up our own, in our own locations to suit our group.
What do you mean about balloons
After, let's say there's a collapse, okay,
I
and
see.
everything's done,
up? Okay.
now all of a sudden, we could still use those to talk to other people. We could still use that repeater up in Nose Hill, no problem. But most likely, we're just going to have our own setup. So, I'll probably turn my house into one, and then that connects Rennie to my house, and then that can actually go and talk to those guys at the standard. So Rennie would be able to talk to them directly using my house. Okay? Because my house would be set up as a crossband. Because I can reach him on UHF, but I can't reach him on VHF. But I can reach them on VHF, but not UHF. So he'd be able to talk to my repeater, and it would be able to talk to them. So that's the beauty of the crossband repeater. And those things have got it built right in, which is a really nice
So-
feature.
So this is actually, in a way, free from government control.
Totally, yeah. The only way that they can mess with this is by jamming it. And a jamming system is going to be very localized, and it's going to jam them too. But it's also got to be specific to the frequencies. So if frequency A gets jammed, we have a protocol already set up that says, in the event of our frequency being jammed, automatically shift to channel X,
Yeah.
which is a different frequency that's no longer jammed because they don't know we're talking about
Right.
it. Okay, so that's kind of how that
And
works.
this is all open communication
Yeah, this
as
is-
long as you can tap into that frequency or
Yeah, well, the
or-
radio taps into the frequency for you. We can set this all up ourselves right here with what we have.
But your friend who on the farm,
Yep.
you said that he owns that frequency.
He owns a frequency, not the one that we were able to connect on.
But let's say he owns that frequency.
Yep.
Can I go onto that frequency and hear him?
Oh, you can listen to any frequency you have access to.
Okay.
It's just whether or not it's legal for you to transmit. Like if I was to actually transmit onto that repeater at Nose Hill,
Right.
that's actually illegal because I'm not a licensed amateur. I'm not
And how
I'm
do
not
you
allowed to
know?
transmit.
Don't know.
Great question. That's one of the questions that we've got over here.
They will know.
Tracking and triangulation. So, when a radio transmits a signal, people can actually zero in on where that signal is coming from based on the strength of it from different directions. So if you're the bad guys trying to zero in on somebody using a frequency, once they kind of got a beat on it, they'd be able to sort of zero in on where it is. That's called triangulation. So they'd be able to go,
Even
okay,
if it's different sources?
yeah, because what we're talking about, the sources are all going to be fairly close together, right? So they're going to know it's in such and such an area. Them actually finding it is going to be a matter of them. Looks like it's a mini Yagi. So remember I told you about the Yagi antenna that's got a boom, a reflector, and then a couple elements like that. So what they do is they would point that. It's a directional antenna, so they would just keep pointing it in a direction until they get the strongest signal, and then they know that it's that direction.
Okay.
And they just keep walking that way, and as they get closer, they zero in on it. And as they get closer, then they zero in. Oh, there it is. It's right there. Okay, and that's how it works. Okay, so that's how they would triangulate a position. The way around that, guesses,
Stop transmitting.
and
Move.
change frequencies.
What if you put in the field again?
Well, if you put in a ferry bag, you're not going to be able to use it, right?
They can't track you.
Correct. Well, you can turn it off and they can't track you. You can even have it turned on.
Okay.
They won't be able to track you unless you're transmitting.
I got it.
Okay? Because there's no signal for them to zero in on, right? So
Is there a time limit for the signal? Yeah.
as long as you're transmitting, somebody can direction find that. At base station, I've got an antenna on my house. I got another one on my trailer.
But let's,
It
yeah,
stands about that high.
right.
It's got 8 fingers that go down. It's called a disc collar. I bought that antenna because it's really good at receiving. And the whole reason I got into radio is to gather information. So I wanted an antenna that's really good at receiving. If I had the antenna at my house, he has at his house, which is just a big, long antenna, I would have probably gotten a much better signal, not only from those guys, but also out to them, using a different antenna. My antenna worked, and that's great. But the reason I have that particular antenna is because I want to try and collect as much information as I can. So, depending on your use case, it's going to depend on which antenna you go with. If you're just going to be using VHF, you don't need to worry about an antenna that works for UHF. Just get a VHF antenna. It's going to do a better job. It's more specialized. My antenna is a kind of a jack of all trades type of antenna. Okay.
There's
Questions?
some things I don't have.
Okay.
Rain.
Frequencies to use. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's use frequencies that already exist, that we can program into our radios, and then maybe we can even practice with them a bit, because really at the end of the day, if you don't know how and when to use these things,
Yeah.
you're going to be bashing your way through it when the shit's already hit the fan, right? So, now, remember, with all of this radio stuff, particularly in Canada, but really anywhere, you're supposed to be a licensed operator to access them. However, there are a handful of frequencies that, number one, nobody cares about, or number two, are actually designed for public use, which we'll talk about when we get to the third slide, second slide, third slide after this one, that you can actually access. You just have to be aware of where you're using them, because there's restrictions. We'll talk about that in a second. So, multi-use radio service, rural services, lab, general trucking, Alberta-wide. These are the ones I was talking about. General use with some restrictions that you need to know. And the reason you need to know them is that if you're using those frequencies in the restriction zone, you're going to be attracting attention. Somebody will come and find you and take your shit, because they can. Okay? So they can seize your equipment if you're using it illegally. Okay? So you need to know those restrictions. MERS, LAD, nobody really cares about them. There's 4 LAD channels we'll talk about in a minute. 2 and 3 aren't even legal in Alberta. So you can totally use them knowing that you're not going to be interfering with anything official in the province. You hear truckers talking on them and swearing on them all the time. Okay? LAD 1 and LAD 4 are legal in Alberta, so you'll hear a little bit more commercial traffic on those ones. But we'll talk about those in a second.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
so it's probably CB.
Yeah.
Okay, now a lot of the truckers have moved to VHF
okay.
because it's better. Okay, CB is great, and here's why. Remember that HF stuff we talked about? 3 to 30, 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz. CB is around 29 megahertz. So it's technically an HF frequency. But the legal wattage, and the only wattage that you're ever going to find in a commercially available CB radio is like 4 watts. That's why they used to work really well. Because they're on the right frequency to get some good distance, but they're only 4 watts, which is why you can only sort of use them when you're sort of passing each other on the highway. Or on either side of town, and that's probably it. Okay? Now, with VHF, that opens up a whole new batch of stuff that we can use to talk to each other. And so a lot of truckers have moved from CB to VHF, specifically LAD. That's where you'll find a lot of them. Now, that said, if you own or you can get a hold of an old school CB radio, do it. Because nobody uses CB anymore. It's one of the last places they're going to be looking for groups that are communicating. Because it's just not used. Why would you use CB when you can use VHF? It's better. Use the new thing. Why would you use 3G if you can use 5G? Let's not go down that rabbit hole, but you get the idea, right? So CBs, I own two of them. I actually have one in the trailer. It's a handheld, or it's a mobile unit that's rigged into my trailer. And then I've got a little portable. It's not much bigger than this thing. It's a CB. And the last time I used it was I was off-roading down in Utah in 2014. And the group was using CB frequencies, and they still do. So MERS, LAD, and Alberta wide are all VHF. Those are going to be good for long distances over fairly simple terrain, grasslands, maybe some foothills, not too bad. UHF, that's the stuff that we need in the city. There's a whole collection of FRS and GMRS radios that you can buy. In Canada, they're actually unlicensed. So anybody can buy them and use them. Yeah, they're walkie-talkies, right? I got 3 of them for my kids for $42. 3 of them. So each of my kids can have one, and their friends can have one, and then all of them can go run around the ranch together and talk. And because I've got a base radio in my trailer, I can listen to them. And I can say, okay, you guys are getting too far, I need you to come back a little bit, please. Right? So it's, works both ways. Those are unlicensed. You can buy these at Walmart. You can buy them in a pack of 5 for probably $60. Okay.
And
They're
not a
like
bad thing.
2-watt radios.
Not a bad thing to have.
They're a great thing to have. I have some at my house that I can use for my community. In fact, I was talking to my buddy in Black Diamond on one of them, using because it was good enough that it could get the kilometer distance from my house in the city and trip my repeater so that I could talk to him in Black Diamond. That was a little handheld. And my fiance had the other one in our bedroom, and her and I were talking, and there's only one spot where she couldn't hear me on a little 2-watt radio over a kilometer away. Pretty good. All right. So let's get into this. Okay. So MERS, multi-use radio service. The kinds of places that use this, or that used to use it the most: rural public works, rural fire departments. This is kind of more public works, but those are the sort of the outfits that used to use MERS. Okay. There's 5 MERS channels. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. MERS 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bandwidth you don't have to worry about. That basically just, how much information are you sending? Like, are you sending photographs over the radio, or are you just sending a voice communication, right? That's what bandwidth talks about. For what we're talking about here, you don't have to worry about that. MERS 1, 151.820, is the one that I was talking to Hammer Hill over by Standard from my garage. But I couldn't reach them on the 166 frequency that they use. We tried a whole bunch of them. But that worked great.
Is the channel the same as a frequency?
So a frequency is an actual, it's a wavelength, okay? It's a wavelength of radio communication. A channel is what that frequency is called in your radio. Make sense? So you could have CTV on channel 2 or channel 3, depending on what area you're in. It's still the same TV station, but it's on a different channel on your TV because of where you are. These radios, we can program these frequencies. This could be channel 56 in my radio, and it could be channel 18 in yours. Doesn't matter, it's the same frequency.
But if we're in a group scenario, we all want to be on the same channel.
You want to be on the same frequency, but we may, like what I'm going to do, when you guys, for those of you that brought radios, if I'm going to program them for you, unless you've got frequencies in there, what I'm going to do is basically just wipe it, and your frequencies are going to be the same as all the other one of those radios in the program. So they're all going to be the same. So your channel 1 is going to be the same as hers, and as hers, and as his, and as his. Okay? But just because that's what it is in those radios, somebody could walk in with a radio that they've got pre-programmed with a whole bunch of frequencies, and it could be a completely different channel. It's just a matter of preference. I've set the channels up in the radios the way that makes sense to me. So I've got MERS, then LAD, then Alberta wide, then the GMRS, then the weather. Because Environment Canada has 10 frequencies that they broadcast weather communications. So you can listen to a weather report. You might even be able to get one here. It's It's weather 2 in Alberta.
How many channels can you put into a radio?
As many as the radio will take. These ones I think take like 999.
That might not be enough.
There you go.
Tuesday night, clear, low -8. Wednesday, sunny, high top 3. Wednesday night, cloudy period, low -6. Thursday, a mix of sun and cloud, high -1.
So you would have to listen to that for a little bit to know where they're talking about. Because when you listen to that one, it'll talk about Calgary, but it'll also talk about, no, it won't talk about Red Deer, that's a different one. That's the one out by my trailer. So when I'm out in Drumheller, I listen to Weather Channel 1, I get Drumheller, I get Three Hills, I get Coronation, I get Oyen, I get Red Deer, I get all kinds of shit. Anna, yep. So I have to listen to make sure I'm listening to the report from my area.
Right.
But in Canada, everywhere you go, you'll be able to get one of them. That's really cool. Okay? So that's why I programmed them into the radios, because guess what? Sorry to break it to you, weather, you need to know that. If we're in a grid down scenario and the shit's hit the fan, we need to know whether we're going to attempt to travel from A to B in a blizzard that's coming in. Now, if it's that bad, those frequencies may be down as well. Who knows?
Yeah.
But until
They're
then,
changing it minute to minute.
correct. But I mean, that's like, real-time updates. Like, that's probably from 2 o'clock today.
That's
Say
my
they're
favorite
gonna be,
frequency in that.
they're
Am I
gonna
gonna
be
fire
adding
it?
them.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So they may not be, but you know what? Doesn't hurt to have them, so I put them in all the radios as
Yeah.
part of the batch. of
But that's where
frequencies.
you're talking to different groups to find out.
Yeah, so if we had a group out in Bragg Creek,
Right,
we'd be able to reach them no problem. And then they could tell us, yeah, we got a blizzard blowing in from the west right now. It's going to probably be with you guys in about an hour and a half.
And then all of a sudden we do
Yeah, and then we'd be like, yeah, okay, got it, thanks. Okay, guys, we've got to get the freaking greenhouses buttoned up. We've got to do this, we've got to do that, we've got to do that. So, MERS, here's the frequencies, and this is kind of who uses them, all right? The next batch of frequencies are the LAD, Logging Administration Dispatch. So, these channels were designed for logging trucks on haul roads. And so what that means is when a truck is full, generally the way that it works is they go somewhere, they set up a camp. That camp is accessed by a railroad. The trucks take the logs from where they get harvested back to camp, they get put on a train, and they get shipped to wherever they're going for processing. Right? When a truck is traveling down the road, are you going to be able to fit another truck on that road if this guy's coming down the road? Not a friggin' chance. You're going to have a head-on collision. But every kilometer or so, they'll have a cutout for a truck to pull off the road. And so then the trucks call themselves by kilometer markers using one of these frequencies. So this one says radio controlled road, LAD 1. Okay, so now you know what frequency you need to be on if you're on this road so you don't head on with anybody. All vehicles must call kilometers. Security enforced. So that means there's going to be people on the road in 4x4s or trucks or whatever looking for trucks not calling themselves. Because they're trying to avoid head-on collisions with logging trucks doing 80 kilometers down a freaking logging road. So what you do is you basically call, okay, I'm at kilometer 7. If I'm going into camp, I'm loaded. If I'm leaving camp, I'm unloaded or empty. Generally you say empty so that there's no confusion. But you would say, kilometer 7, empty. So then they know you're coming out if they're going in. They're like, oh, that guy's coming towards me. There's a pullout right here, I'm going to grab it because he's already past the marker. And then I'm going to wait for him to go by, and then I'm going to pull out and keep going. That's how those work. So that's what those frequencies are for. Now, there's like 30 of them. In BC, there's like 32, I think, channels like this for radio-controlled roads. These ones have now sort of been adopted. They're still in use on logging roads, but they've kind of been adopted by truckers. So LAD 4 and LAD 1 are legal in Alberta, and you'll hear the truckers talking to each other. When I'm driving on the highway, and I've got a radio in my vehicle, I'm listening to Lab 1. And I've actually gotten weather or traffic reports where I know that there's a fuck up down the highway and I need to skirt around that if I don't get stuck in it for now, right? I've been able to give other people information. You know, they're coming up the highway from Calgary, I'm heading back, and they're like, hey, is that accident still at exit yada yada yada? And then I was like, oh shit, that's the exit I'm looking at right now. And I was like, no, it's empty, they've got the vehicles on the side of the road, you're clear. He's like, great, thanks. That's helpful, right? So, these frequencies, they're known frequencies, and that's the beauty of MERS and LAD and Alberta wide, they're known frequencies. So we can put them into all the radios, and every group like us can put them into all radios. And then we've at least got a frequency that we know we can probably talk on. All right? So, those are the LAD frequencies.
So you said 1 and 4 are the legal ones?
Yeah, 1 and 4 are legal in Alberta. They all still work. It's just you're not going to hear anybody official on 2 and 3. It's going to be guys shooting shit. Okay? So, Alberta-wide frequencies. So there's 6 of them. You need to know what the restrictions are. For example, and they're not just Alberta. They're actually right across the country. They just call them Alberta-wide because we're cool and we invented them. I think. So, areas, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. Exclusions. Not to be used within 90 kilometers of Strathmore, Alberta. What are the chances?
Why?
It just happens to be where we are. Probably because there's a plant there that uses it. Okay? And that plant has probably paid for use of that frequency within 90 kilometers of Strathmore. Okay? Here's another one. That's 153.050. 162.210. Alberta, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut only. Whatever. Not to be used within 50 kilometers of Crossfield, Alberta. What are the chances? Right, so there's 2 that we can't use here. Okay? Because we're in 90 kilometers of Calgary and within 50K of Caulfield. So, you might be able to use it on the south end here, but as soon as you head up to the north end of the city, you're going to be within 50K of Crossfield.
So should we know this? Should this?
If you're going to use these, I would just get a hold of this cheat sheet and keep it with your radio. That's the easiest thing.
You don't have it.
But really, at the end of the day, for what we're talking about, everything's going to be gone to shit by the time we're using these things on a regular basis anyway.
Yeah.
So guess what? I don't care if that plant is using that frequency.
Yeah.
If I need to talk to my buddy that's trying to find his way to the trailer because he's evacuating his family, I'm going to talk to him. However, in the meantime, Alberta-wide 6, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, no exclusions. Have at it. So you can use 6. These are all available on the internet. You can download them yourself. They're all available, and I'm going to put them in your radios for you.
Oh.
Okay? So here's one. Not to be used within 50 kilometers of Calgary. Awesome. Or 50 kilometers of McGrath. Not to be used within 110 clicks of Wiseton, Saskatchewan. I don't even know where that is. Or 110 clicks of Fillmore, Saskatchewan. Must not be used south of 50 north.
Not be used at all? Like,
Right. What do you think that means?
Latitude.
Right. Why? What's south of 50 north? The border.
Oh.
So that tells you that somebody that's kind of running shit along the border is using that frequency and they've paid for privacy, or they've paid for exclusion. So guess what I'm going to be if I'm trying to run the border? I'm going to probably be monitoring that one. They've got their own frequencies as well, but for some reason, this one is used around the border. I don't know why. I don't know who uses it. Maybe it's just a happy coincidence and it's a massive cattle farm. But south of 50 north?
Some of them, the one right above it.
50 north is right across the country. So my guess is it has something to do with border control. Right? So get a hold of this and you guys can know those exclusions. But know that 6 is golden and probably 5 unless you're within 50K of Lake Louise. 5 and 6, you're pretty safe. Okay? And the reason I got these pictures is these are the kind of people that are probably going to be using these frequencies. Okay? You got Buddy Trucker here. You've got little chickie poo that's hanging out with her family and playing around on the radio, whatever. Sally Longhole over here, and then Jim Bob from his farm. Like anybody. Could be us with our, preparedness group. So it's one of those, the Alberta wides, with the exception of these exclusions, how about it? Right? So, UHF. These are the GMRS radios. You've seen these. Everybody's seen them. You buy them in a pack for $40, $50 for 3 of them or whatever. These are the ones that I bought for my kids. They're all probably about 2 watts. There's all the GMRS frequencies. Also, available on the internet. And most of the time when you buy these radios, they're going to be listed on the instruction pamphlet that comes with the radios. Okay? So that you know what frequencies you're going to be on. Now, a lot of these are going to be using those tones. Remember the tones we talked about for repeaters? So a lot of these come pre-programmed with tones. So they're limited. And those tones, you can't mess with those. These are not programmable. Those are factory. That's how they're made. Some of them, you can select the tones. Like the ones that I bought for the kids, I deliberately looked through all the information on Amazon to figure out which ones were accessible by anybody on those frequencies. So that tells me that the tones are optional. You can choose them and you can they're user selectable. Right? Something like this, something like probably these two, those tones are going to be built right into the radio and you're not going to be able to adjust them. So I could be on GMRS 22 and my kids could be on it and we're not going to be able to talk to each other because my radio, well, I can play around with it until I find the right tone, but it's going to take a long time. There's like 200 tones. So there's going to be a lot of trial and error before I find the one that those radios are working on, right? So the easiest thing to do is just buy radios where that's user selectable. So that's what I did. So now I turn them off on the kids' radios and I turn them off on my radio so I can talk to the kids while they're running around the farm where the trailer is, and all good. But there's your GMRS frequency. So these are UHF.
Question.
So hang on one sec.
Okay.
So if you were to set up a crossband repeater on one of the GMRS frequencies as your UHF, anybody with one of these radios can access that repeater. So that's kind of cool. Right.
So the EMP,
Not heard of
it just fries things out, right? Like an EMP, like
Yeah.
it's totally fried.
Well, it might. There's a lot of discussion about, okay, who doesn't know what an EMP is? Okay, so, electromagnetic pulse. There's 2 sort of main things that it comes from. Number 1 is a nuclear detonation in the atmosphere. So you don't have to worry about radiative fallout, but you do have to worry about the wave that it sends out, that's electronic energy that can fry circuits and things like that. The other place that it comes from is the sun. So when the sun has a flare, it erupts off the surface of the sun and it sends out these charged particles into the solar system. When those charged particles hit the atmosphere of the Earth, what happens is the magnetosphere around the Earth bends and flexes to absorb those. But if they're strong enough, they can actually collapse the magnetosphere and those will actually make contact with the surface of the Earth. And then you'll get a thing like what happened in 1859 called the Carrington event, where it was such a powerful flare that those waves collapsed, or those particles collapsed the magnetosphere, hit the Earth, and then they run right along any sort of conductive surface. Antennas, power lines, phone lines, telegraph lines in this case in 59. And a lot of the telegraph stations, some of them got lit up in fire, some of the operators got electrocuted, but we haven't had a flare of that magnitude since that one. That's actually not true. We had one. We had one in 2012. So if this is the sun and Earth is here, it was a massive, massive flare. and the EMP that it emitted was massive, but it was on the other side. Had it come off the other side of the sun, or we had been in a different place in our orbit, would have been probably lights out. Scary, scary shit. And that's a perfectly normal, naturally occurring phenomenon. Normally, it doesn't get that bad, but this particular one, if you look at this spaceweather.com, it shows you graphic representations of the flare. And Earth is just like, it's just a little pinhole, right, relative to the sun. So even a small flare from the sun can do a lot of damage to an itty-bitty planet like ours. Because the sun is just massive, right? You're talking about the head of a pin versus that wall. Like, it's on a scale that we just can't even fathom because it's so big. So, so had we been on the other side of our orbit, so had it been a different time of year, that would have run right over us like a steamroller. And that would have been badly embarrassing. So, your question about EMPs was what exactly?
Just what, like, I mean, it could fry out.
Yeah, so the U.S. government did a lot of tests with EMPs for exactly this kind of a use case. So they're like, okay, what's going to happen if somebody detonates a nuke in the atmosphere? Has anybody ever watched the space station tracker online? N2YO.com. And you can see, you'll see where the space station is. There's a checkbox that you can select called footprint. And that will show you how much of the Earth the space station can see from where they are right now. And it's a big circle that basically just imprints on the map where they're flying over. And they're roughly 300 to 500 kilometers altitude, okay? So that'll give you a fairly good representation of the kind of area that a nuke detonated at that altitude would cover. So just to give you a frame of reference, 300 kilometers in the atmosphere, let's say North Korea would send a nuke over to try and black out the States, and they detonate that at 300 kilometers in the atmosphere, that electromagnetic pulse, if they center it on the States, it'll reach all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico and all the way up past Edmonton. And that's assuming they hit it dead on in the middle of the U.S. If they're up a little bit, it's going to go further. If they're down a little bit, it might not reach. Right? But that's basically it. So it's a radius. All right. So yes, it can mess this stuff up, but they've done tests on it. They did tests where they fired electromagnetic pulses at vehicles. And they're like, okay, basically what they found is that if the vehicle is running, those are the ones that are most susceptible. If it's turned off, some of them didn't even blink. It was like no biggie, turn them on, no problem. Some of them that were running. What's that?
That's the older vehicle.
Well, they did this test back in the 90s, so not that old. But a lot of the new vehicles have got lots of computers. But what they found is that even the ones, most of the ones that were running, that got hit with the electromagnetic pulse, it scrambled some of the electronics and the circuits and things like that, but as soon as the person turned it off and turned it back on, all that stuff cleared. And it was fine. Minimal damage. There were a couple that were toasted and they couldn't get them started again. So
it's about like electrical vehicles. They be fried and yeah.
most likely, yeah.
Don't
I would think
Tesla.
so.
Don't buy a Tesla.
Yeah, I know. That's why I thought about it. After I started learning about this shit, I'm like, yeah, maybe I don't want a Tesla. So, bottom line, yes, they can mess things up, but we don't have enough data to know whether they will for certain. But we still protect things that are important to us in Faraday bags in case. And that's the bottom line. We don't know. There's not enough data. We haven't had that many of those kind of flares. And there's only been a few nuclear detonations. And they haven't done any of them in the atmosphere because, God forbid, it actually did a lot of damage. It could cripple the country. Right? So there's not really a lot of places they can test that shit. Because even a boat on the ocean is going to get fried.
Yeah.
Right? So, anyway. So this is your GMRS. These are your frequencies. So if you set up your crossband with a GMRS frequency, now you've got your whole group that has these radios can access them. You don't have to give them the right? They'll still work, but just a kind of a cheaper way of handling it. Let's talk about equipment. So these are the ones that we've got here. This is a thing. So this is also a valve phone radio. This is a thing called the UV5R. That has been a preparedness standard for many, 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 many years. People still buy them any chance they get. They're great little radios. They're 5 watts though. These are 10. Okay? So, but I can't get them. But it's a solid piece of kit. Lots of people like them and they're fairly inexpensive. I got a buddy of mine who just bought 2 of them for $5, I think. 120 maybe. But again, 5 watts. So not a lot of juice, okay, versus 10 watts. This is a Yaesu. So you've got your sort of cost-effective versions down here, and then you've got your more pricey kind of high-end gear over here. And everything works well, it's just a different build quality, okay? When I first started getting into this, I hadn't even met Randy. I bought 4 of these, and I love them. But they're like $260 a piece now. And they're still only 5 watts. But it's a nice little radio, and these kind of commercially available radios that you can buy at GPS Central or your local radio store, when they're sold in Canada, they come locked to what's legal in Canada. These come out of China. China doesn't give a shit what's legal in Canada. What's going to sell the most radios? Hence, 10 watts, completely unlocked. Okay? So this one, in order to unlock it, I had to open up the radio, take the knobs, take the little waterproof things, take the antenna off, crack the radio open, pull out the circuit board, and then I had to remove a resistor. I swear to God, you see this little dot on the board here? It was that small. Like I literally couldn't find it after I popped it off the circuit board. And that one resistor is what keeps it locked to certain frequencies. As soon as I pulled that off, opens the radio up. So there's mods that you can do if you know how to do it to these ones that are commercially available, but it's definitely going to void your warranty. And these ones you don't have to, and they're half the price. So just go with these ones.
And they're higher wattage.
Yeah.
And they're higher wattage, yeah, because China doesn't care.
But they would care enough to put something and drop it in there.
You know what? They might, but really at the end of the day, if China's trying to cripple us, you think they're going to do it through these handheld radios? Probably not. Right? They're going to do it with sleeper cells and Chinese police stations locally and all that sort of stuff, right?
Which were already set up.
Correct. Let's take 5.
I mean, they're gonna
Well, you don't
cover
connect the
it.
radios. You just decide on a time and a frequency for the group to talk. And then the radios will either connect or they won't, depending on your antenna setup and height and power and all this stuff.
So,
Questions? Gone through a lot today. Is that worth $25? Okay. Yeah, I hope so. We got to touch on these. Hang on a second. Okay, so how close to talk? We talked about that when we talked about VHF, UHF, all that sort of stuff. So VHF, you could get out as much as, well, clearly I tested at 65. That was pretty good. All the way out to 160 kilometers. UHF, I mean, I don't know what that is by the crow as the crow flies from my house to his. But I know that he's tested these radios on UHF, and they're only 8 watts. Those radios, they reached 8 kilometers around 2 mountains using UHF frequencies on that. So these things are good. So that's pretty good for UHF. That's really good. So when even though you're out in the wilderness, if you're around mountains, especially if they're like high iron content, you may switch from VHF to UHF around the mountains. But then once you get out to the prairies, you bump it back up to VHF. So you've gone your distance because there's less of a